Good afternoon to everyone. It is wonderful to see you all. My name is Doug Poe, and I am the director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. Let me open us with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we're so thankful for this day. We're thankful, Lord, for those who are gathered with us as we look at your church. We ask, Lord, that you would open our hearts and minds so that we can take what we learned today to help congregations to be more effective in their work. We ask all of this in your Son's name. Amen. Again, greetings to you. And today we're going to talk about trends relevant for denominations. Let me first share a little bit about this project. This project is the Religious Workforce Project. It is a multi-year investigation, of changing patterns of how congregations are served. This project has a qualitative and a quantitative component. We, in the qualitative, studied over 40 congregations in the DC area, and that data is going to be shared later. Today, we're going to deal with the quantitative component. For the quantitative component, our data is often limited to solo or lead pastors, but we do have really good data. We've also pulled from national survey data and statistics provided to us by multiple denominations. Excuse me. And most of our data is from 2000 to 2019. What is exciting about this work is we're going to also have 10 research reports that are going to come out, and you're actually helping us with this process. What we share today, we're going to get feedback from you, so please fill out the online survey. That will help us to create the final report. The survey will come a little bit later today when you receive the rest of the packet information, so please fill out that survey. And not only will you find sort of the findings, but also implications and recommendations in the report. Before I introduce our speakers, if you have questions, please raise your hand with the little hand from Zoom, or you could put it in the chat, and Matt will make sure the question is asked. Presenting today are the founding director, Dr. Lovett Weems, now our senior consultant with the Lewis Center, and Dr. Amy Kubicek, our research associate. Let me now turn it over to Lovett.
Thank you very much, Doug, and welcome to everyone. We appreciate your help with this project and the opportunity to share some insights. And many of you have been helpful in other ways in sharing data from your traditions and in participating in interviews that we have conducted. So Amy and I will be presenting some trends that will not be surprises to you, but we hope will set the stage to think about what implications there may be for denominations and for your work. We began with a series of congregational trends impacting the religious workforce. In drawing from available denominational statistics, we cover a 20-year period from 2000 to 2019, ending just before the pandemic that skewed many statistics. Keep in mind that the pandemic didn't change most of the trends we will review, but rather accelerated existing trends. In drawing from national survey research, most of the data comes generally from the same 20-year span. The trend with which we began is one of the most obvious: declining attendance. Median worship attendance has declined by half, from 130 in 2000 to 65 in 2020. Mainline denominations show even lower median attendance. The median attendance means that half of the churches have attendance larger than the median and half have attendance below the median. The pace of declining attendance is increasing. The exception to the declining attendance trend is very large churches with 15 or more in attendance, especially newer non-denominational churches. The second trend is fewer new adherents. This refers to how many people are making first-time professions of faith each year. These charts show for different denominations the ratio of average worship attendance for each one profession of faith. Figures are shown for 2000 and 2019. Evangelical denominations for which we have data are on the left and mainline on the right. The lower the number, the more effective denominations are in reaching new believers, at least based on this measure. Evangelical denominations show a mixed pattern of maintaining strong effectiveness in reaching new adherents in some denominations, meaning lower ratios, such as the Assemblies of God and the Wesleyan Church, and declining effectiveness, meaning higher ratios in other denominations, such as Church of the Nazarene and the Southern Baptist Convention. Mainline denominations are consistently less effective in reaching new adherents in 2019 than in 2000. This chart captures another trend among denominations. This example comes from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, or ELCA, but is representative of some other traditions as well. The chart looks at professions of faith in relationship to deaths from 2000 to 2019. Historically, most denominations have had far more new believers than deaths each year. This changed for the ELCA beginning in 2016, when the number of deaths surpassed the number of professions of faith. Another related trend is that older people are overrepresented in U.S. churches, with aging becoming more pronounced. In 2020, 33% of church participants were 65 or older, while only 17% of the general population was at this age. But age varies by traditions. Mainline are the oldest. Catholic and evangelical Protestants are somewhat younger. Black Protestants are the youngest, though older than the overall population. Another trend is slow but steady increases in racial and ethnic diversity in congregations over recent decades, as documented by the National Congregation Study. There are fewer all-white congregations. This chart shows that there are more multiracial congregations, meaning that no one group comprises 80% or more of participants. However, the differences among traditions are significant, with Roman Catholics having the highest percentage of multiracial congregations and mainline Protestants having the lowest percentage. After examining these congregational trends, we now turn to see how these trends are causing congregational challenges. The first challenge we explore is the increasing number of small churches among Protestant traditions. This is not a trend among Roman Catholics because they have reduced the number of parishes as the Catholic population increased. In 2020, only 30% of churches had 100 or more attending. where your full-time clergy most serve, down from 55% in 2000, according to Faith Communities Today research. This chart is based on data from 7 evangelical and mainline Protestant denominations between 2000 and 2019. Their combined share of churches with fewer than 50 in average worship attendance increased from 41% in 2000 to 57% in 2019. Notice especially that there were over 4,000 more churches with 25 or fewer worshipers in 2019 than in 2000. Another challenge congregations face is financial. Personnel spending varies as a percentage of expenditures across traditions. Mainline Protestants spend the highest percent of their budgets on personnel, 55%. Black Protestants spend the lowest, 24%. Catholics spend 43%. Evangelical Protestants spend 49%. Few denominations segment spending so that personnel expenditures can be isolated. The Church of the Nazarene and the United Methodist Church are exceptions. There we documented increased proportionate spending on personnel between 2000 and 2019. In addition, fewer churches appear to have the size and resources to afford a full-time pastor.
Now we begin looking at how these congregational challenges lead to changing deployment patterns for clergy, and we begin with churches that are served part-time. Churches served part-time appear to be a growing occurrence across U.S. congregations, though the evidence of growth is not unanimous, and methods of counting are not consistent. Part-time pastors, common among many traditions, are becoming more prevalent within denominations for which full-time ministry has been the assumed standard, even if the goal was never totally achieved. Despite more retired clergy available to serve in more congregations of the size they normally serve, that is, 50 or fewer in attendance, the percentage of churches served by retired pastors has remained relatively constant since 2000. There's little indication that retired clergy are the primary source to serve the growing pool of very small congregations. Another way a church is served part-time is by sharing a pastor with another congregation. Sharing a pastor appears to require a hierarchical clergy placement system. Such sharing beyond Catholic and Methodist traditions will probably increase, but modestly due to polity, resistance, and availability of willing partner pastors and congregations. Another type of part-time pastoral leader is represented by bivocational ministry. Bivocational ministry has a long history beginning with the Apostle Paul and continuing today worldwide. The Black church tradition provides perhaps the richest U.S. history with bivocational clergy. Bivocational clergy serve about a third of churches, and 30% of seminary graduates in North America plan to have a bivocational ministry. There is a renewed interest today in bivocational ministry as fewer churches can afford a full-time pastor. Bivocational pastors are often more adept in reaching constituencies for which available and credentialed clergy have little to no cultural and social affinity. And bivocational pastors report positive experiences despite challenges. But clergy and congregations tend to view the prospect of bivocational ministry for themselves with caution. Now we see how changed deployment patterns impact pastoral leader education especially its expansion into lay pastoral leaders of one type or another within both Protestant and Catholic traditions. Evangelical and Black Protestant traditions have historically provided for multiple ways for individuals to qualify to serve as pastors, thus requiring fewer adjustments in recent years. Today, pastoral leaders beyond ordained clergy with seminary degrees are needed more for pastoral leadership among all traditions than in the past. Mainline Protestants, because of declining church sizes, and Roman Catholics, due to a shortage of priests, have required the most adjustment to new circumstances. Today, mainline denominations that once required the Master of Divinity for all their clergy are now developing some alternate education routes to ministry. One example is the Theological Education for Emerging Ministries, otherwise known as TEAM, that is used by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. United Methodists have had the course of study educational route to ministry from almost their beginning in the US. As more clergy went to seminary, course of study enrollment has declined before taking a turn upward in recent decades. Today, almost 40% of United Methodist churches are served by course of study graduates, compared to just a quarter in 2000. And these programs are usually in partnership with their denominational seminaries. The other shift among mainline denominations is the use of lay pastors, and some of the names are listed here. There have been comparable changes within the Roman Catholic Church that have led to more non-priest pastoral leaders. And some of the factors that leading to these changes for Catholics include Vatican II, fewer priests, reduction of parishes, but not enough to match the decline in the number of priests, fewer associate priests, and an increased number of parishes sharing a priest, which leaves many parishes without a resident priest. Parish associates, parish life coordinators, and lay ecclesial ministers serve smaller and more rural parishes with fewer resident priests, and they also serve in growing larger parishes with fewer associate priests available to them. There are about 40,000 lay ecclesial ministers serving in parishes currently.
Next, we see how changes in pastoral leader education impacts theological schools. While many lead pastors have graduate degrees, there is much variation among traditions. The MDiv shows resilience even for students for whom it is not a church requirement. Yet there are also trends away from seminary degrees for clergy. Some of the congregational trends we are seeing means that it is not surprising to see that seminary enrollment is declining in a number of cases. This chart shows enrollment of all mainline denominational students in any ATS accredited seminary between 2000 and 2019. The blue portion shows a 50% decline in MDiv enrollment. The red portion shows a more modest decline in other professional master's degrees. The blue portion of this chart shows a 10% decline in MDiv enrollments of all evangelical Protestant denominational students in any ATS accredited seminary between 2000 and 2019. The decline becomes 20% if the large numbers and more modest losses of Southern Baptists are excluded. The red portion shows minimal decline in other professional master's degrees. Black Protestant enrollment declines are less than mainline, but more than evangelical, with virtually all the decline occurring in the Master of Divinity degree program. Total Catholic enrollments declined 13%, which, similar to evangelical Protestants, shows relative stability compared to other traditions. All these changes impact clergy demographics. We begin by looking at trends in the age of clergy. The percentage of lead pastors 55 or older increased over 42% since 1998. About 60% or more of Black evangelical and mainline Protestant lead pastors are 55 or older. Roman Catholic clergy shifted somewhat younger since 1998. These columns show age groups using blue for under 35, red for 35 to 54, and green for 55 to 72. The column on the left, on the far left, shows the age breakdown of the U.S. population ages 25 to 72. The columns that follow to the right show clergy age breakdowns for Black Protestant, evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, and Roman Catholic traditions. You will see that there is a dramatic and unprecedented gap between the makeup of the population ages 25 to 34 and the scarcity of clergy younger than 35 in all religious traditions.
We next turn to trends related to clergy gender. In this chart, the blue columns represent women MDiv graduates, and the red columns represent women solo or lead pastors. The comparisons are for three religious traditions, with Black Protestant on the left, Evangelical Protestant in the center, and Mainline Protestant on the right. For many years now, the percentage of women MDiv graduates from seminaries has surpassed their presence among lead pastors of congregations. We now look at comparisons across specific denominations for which we have the necessary data. And this chart shows that the percentage of churches that have women as solo or lead pastors in 2000 and 2019. The blue columns in most cases represent 2000 percentages, while the red columns represent 2019 percentages. And you can see that women as lead pastors has increased since 2000 for all of these denominations. This chart looks at changes in attendance size of churches served by women as a percentage of attendance size of churches served by men in 2000 and 2019. And again, the blue columns represent 2000 percentages, while the red columns represent 2019 percentages. And each of these columns shows how the median attendance of churches served by women compares to the churches served by men for 2000 and 2019. So as an example, for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, in 2000, the median attendance of churches served by women was 58% of the median attendance of congregations served by men. And by, And now we look at the percentage of churches with 251 or more in attendance led by clergy women, which has increased, although the progress is limited and varies considerably across denominations. For each of the denominations shown in this chart, 3 percentages are shown. The first column in each set in the blue depicts the percentage of congregations with 251 or more in attendance that had a female pastor in 2000. The middle column in red shows the percentage of congregations with 251 or more in attendance served by women in 2019. And the third column in each set, in the green, shows the percentage of all congregations led by women in 2019. One final word about gender comparisons takes us back to the earlier slides showing the makeup of the church pool and how it's changed in the past 2 decades. So we need to remember that changes or gains in parity for clergy women come within a context of congregational decline that means more limited opportunities for both women and for men. And so we now turn to trends related to clergy race. Historical and cultural factors in the US have shaped the racial and ethnic composition of congregations and clergy in each Christian tradition. And no predominantly white denomination has a history with which they can look with pride in this regard. Since 2000, the greatest growth in racial and ethnic diversity occurred within the Roman Catholic tradition, especially due to the increasing share of Hispanic priests. However, clergy race analysis in most denominations is difficult because racial designations for clergy are usually not part of the statistical reports collected by denominations. We first look at racial demographics within the evangelical Protestant tradition. So first you look at the chart on the left, and that shows that 3/4 of evangelical Protestant congregations are led by a white pastor, which is about the same as the racial membership of these denominations. There is some growing diversity among evangelical Protestant MDiv graduates. The chart on the right shows the racial and ethnic breakdown of MDiv graduates from evangelical Protestant seminaries for the years 1998, 2006, 2012, and 2018. The white percentage of MDiv graduates declined from 81% in 1998 to 66% in 2018. And the greatest percentage growth has come among both Black and Hispanic MDiv graduates, with smaller gains among Asian graduates. Now we look at clergy race demographics within the mainline Protestant tradition. And again, if you look at the chart on the left, it shows that across the mainline Protestant denominations, 90% of solo or lead pastors are white, which is about the same as the racial membership of these denominations. And similar to the evangelical Protestant tradition, there is some growing diversity among mainline clergy. And this should continue given the increased racial and ethnic diversity of MDiv graduates from mainline seminaries over the past 2 decades, which is shown in the chart on the right. The chart on the right shows the racial and ethnic breakdown of MDiv graduates from mainline seminaries from 1998 through 2018. The white percentage of MDiv graduates decreased from 84% in 1998 to 69% in 2018. And similar to the evangelical Protestant tradition, the greatest percentage growth has come among Black MDiv graduates, and there have been more modest gains among Asian and Hispanic graduates. And finally, we look at clergy race demographics among the Roman Catholic tradition. The chart on the left shows that the Roman that within the Roman Catholic Church, by 2018, 53% of solo or lead priests were white, which is somewhat less than the white makeup of their membership. And this is a major change since 1998, when 97% of priests were white. And the overwhelming change since 1998 is the increase in the number of Hispanic priests, which increased from just 2% of priests in 1998 to a third of priests leading parishes in 2018. However, the chart on the right shows that the racial makeup of Catholic MDiv graduates has changed more gradually than the racial makeup of the priests leading parishes. So we see that especially among Hispanic students, there have been more modest gains. And this is because most of the increased Hispanic diversity among priests has come from priests coming here from other countries.
Now we want to turn to any questions for clarification you might have, but we primarily want to hear from you in terms of experience, your own experience in your traditions, how these may be similar or different, and especially as you're thinking toward the future, what are the implications of these trends? What changes are you having to make? How are you adjusting to what many see as a somewhat new environment for the churches today? So, as was mentioned at the beginning, you may submit your questions or comments through the chat function, or simply use the raised hand method. We'd be happy to hear from you. Matt, do we have anything that's already come in?
Yes, Dr. Weems, I have a question. Based upon the data you have shared in terms of church decline, is the U.S. headed in the same direction as England?
Well, that point is often made, and while there are variations in circumstances and a lot of different histories there, it certainly is true that the U.S. is looking more like European models, but there's so many cultural and social differences. But one thing that you're beginning to see that since the 1990s, that's one of the big changes, is that from the time that questions were asked about denominational affiliation, those that would say no affiliation, or what are called now the nones, that tended to stay in a very narrow range, usually somewhere around the 2 to 5%, 3% or something. And that changed in the 90s. And it started going up far higher, even into the 20s range. There's been some reporting of some leveling off in more recent years, but that is a major change in our situation in the U.S., certainly.
I do have a question here about a very common question. as to, do you have any data on why clergy in the 34-year-old category have declined so sharply?
Well, this is an issue that the Lewis Center has been looking at a long time. Every year we do a report called Clergy Age Trends in the United Methodist Church, and we've been doing that since 2005. And so, and then periodically we would do this for some other, we would collect figures from other denominations and see how similar the trends are. Now, the conventional wisdom for some has been that what this represents is simply the movement of the baby boom generation through the life cycle. And there's some truth to that. For example, you will remember from some of those slides that a tremendous decline in this 20-year period has taken place in the 35 to 54 range. And that's because so many in this group aged out into that 55 and above group. So, and during these 20 years, the 55 and above percentage of active clergy has gone up considerably. Just the population trends can account for a good bit of that. What it does not account for, the population trends, is what's going on in the below 35 category. And that the slide that shows that is where you see the representation in the population, just the population 25 to 72 of the major overrepresentation in the population of under 35 and underrepresentation among congregational clergy. Now, there have been a number of reasons that have been given. One is that folks are just doing things later now, and we average age of seminarians has gone up. But when you compare it to groups that require similar education, say dentist, there's been a little bit of decline in the percentage of under 35 dentists, say a couple of percentage points, but nothing like what we've seen. Under 35 clergy in the 70s represented certainly 20-something%. And we know from other eras that younger clergy were more represented. One reason in the earlier years of denominations that under 35 clergy were more represented was that the life expectancy of clergy was not nearly as great. And so that was part of the factor. So there are lots of things. I'll just mention one other. In the United States, the population 65 and above is relatively modestly racially diverse. But the population, say, younger than 20 is radically diverse racially. And when you start getting down to some younger ages, actually whites are a minority. And in the last census, the only racial group that declined in population was whites. it was a very modest increase, but it was the first time in history that's taken place, at least census history. So to the extent that we are reaching more diverse persons, the chances are they're going to be younger. To the extent that we don't, they're going to be older, typically.
Dr. Weems, Mitch Phillips has his hand up.
Great. Mitch.
Hi there. My name is Mitch Phillips. I serve on the Synod staff for the ELCA Northeastern Ohio Synod, and most of my work is with the transition process between pastors and congregations. And I learned early on that I think part of my role is truth telling. So I appreciate the data because that's part of the story I tell congregations. What it strikes me that there's nothing surprising in this. They told me when I graduated from seminary 33 years ago, we were headed for a clergy shortage down the road. But the reality is that the average person in the pew doesn't know this, doesn't see this. And it's the people in the pew. So you asked about implications for our work and stuff. Yes. At least for our polity, because we don't have the Episcopal type, bishop authority polity, it requires the people in the pew to understand what we're up against in order for an individual congregation to be willing to explore something new and different. And so that's I appreciate this information. Part of what we're wrestling with on our staff as we try and figure out what 21st century Christianity looks like is how do we help the average person in the pew understand the implications of all of this.
Oh, very good. Thank you for that contribution. Interestingly, one thing we discovered in non-authoritarian Episcopal polities is that it's not that arrangements such as shared pastors that don't work. In fact, they actually do work, and they tend to work better, but they're very difficult to make happen. Now, in ELCA, they're fortunate to have someone like you or the bishop who can at least be a person that might say, well, we think we know of a pastor who might be interested in this, or we know of another church in your area that is coming up on a retirement and they don't know what they're going to do. But it's so time consuming to make that happen, to find the churches that are near enough and pastors who are willing to do that, and pastors that are available for where your churches are located. That is very hard. However, we found that when they do set up something like this, they typically work. Yeah. And one reason they work is that there has been so much deliberation and so much discussion and involvement that people are committed to it and they've worked out the issues. Now, 50% of Roman Catholic parishes share a parish, and almost 40% of United Methodist churches share a priest for Catholics and share a pastor for United Methodist. And I don't know a single one of those parishes or churches that are happy with it. And yet, when people have worked and worked and worked to put together this parish, they tend to have a lot of commitment to make it work and can be pretty happy. They can have a resident pastor, generally resident pastor, when before they couldn't. And again, for people in your position in other traditions as well, they are looking at bivocational as a possibility because, for example, there may be someone located in this area where you now have few churches that have full-time resident pastors. And this is someone who's feeling a call to ministry. And they could make that move to seminary, get a seminary degree, and yet when they come back, you may not have a church to recommend there. Whereas if they could find a way to get that seminary education, in your situation through the teen program or through seminaries are much more accessible today because of online and intensives and all. If that person could find a way to get that education and get their credentials, there would always be an important place of ministry for them in most places. And they would be able to support themselves, and if they have families, to support their families as well.
In fact, this weekend I'm going to two congregations who will be voting to call a pastor together to serve them. That we have great hopes for. The places where it has not worked so well tend to be shotgun marriages at best. It's done out of desperation and not a vision for ministry and hopeful. It's, last ditch effort. So, and part of what we want to explore, one of our synods in Pennsylvania is working on larger coalitions of congregations, 6 congregations that share a staff, a couple pastors, stuff that we're trying to figure out where that might fit within our polity as well, and how to help make that work. And so that it's an interesting day to be doing this. People want the answers. They don't want the answers that we have to give them. So how do we engage in conversation around that? And so the data you're sharing, I love the question that somebody's got in there about bivocational ministry. Are there particular other occupations that you found fit real well with this? Are there areas of the country that seems to be embraced more? We ordained somebody earlier this year in bivocational ministry. So we're thrilled to have that. And want to embrace that as a possibility for other places as well. Thank you.
2 things matter on bivocational ministry. I think one is that polity does matter. And that's where, when you talk to like association directors for Baptists or others in more evangelical traditions, they have had often a smoother transition because it's just much easier for the full-time, part-time, bivocational, and that sort of thing. But one is, within other traditions, polity is an issue. Take a look to see if you have things that restrict or make it very harder for bivocational clergy. In the United Methodist Church, only in recent years could someone who was an elder serve part-time at all, or have any other employment outside of that. And now you can apply to be less than full-time and to do some other kind of work. But the assumption is everyone's going to be full time on that. That's one. The other is that bivocational ministers talk about how excluded they feel from the life of their denomination and the life of their synod or other units, because and I realized one time when we were working with a Judicatory in which 2/3 of their churches were served part-time, that as they made their plans for their annual conventions, for their pastor schools, for their continuing education, it was all planned with the assumption that these are full-time seminary graduates who are available any time of the week. And that's not the case. And we have like, I know some on here, bivocational has been very common with the Nazarene tradition that Rich Housel's here, or in the Church of the Brethren, Audrey Hollingberg Duffy, where even more so than the Church of the Nazarene in terms of percentages of your pastors probably are bivocational. And I see your hands raised also. Let's go to that, and then we'll go to Kevin after that.
Sure. Yeah, my mind's been buzzing with several components because I'm in the Church of the Brethren. I serve on varied levels of the hierarchy. So I'm a team pastor with my spouse, but I also coordinate ministry training programs at a non-degree level for the Church of the Brethren, and I'm adjunct faculty at my denominational seminary. So I kind of, I'm bivocational is a conversation that we're having at all of those levels. And so theologically, the Church of the Brethren has a strong foundation for bivocational ministry because we have a history of free ministry, where there, was education for ministers, but they were not compensated at all. Or if they were compensated, it was in a meal or a chicken. So that, there's a strong theological background for that, but we have moved so far away from that in terms of polity, that we're having to kind of reach back into our historical treasure troves to bring back out that rich theology. But it's shifted how we do education at the seminary level, and that just in the last year, we received a Lilly grant, where part of the on-campus experience at Bethany Theological Seminary includes community connection that is intentionally meant to provide experience in other types of vocational opportunities that might pair well with pastoral ministry. And so a lot of experiences in not-for-profit that can go into that. So they're starting to think of graduating Master of Divinity students with other types of training opportunities. From my next hat at the non-degreed ministry training, we are actually providing specific courses to think about bivocational ministry from a theological perspective, but also from a simple things like time management is a huge part of bivocational ministry that we don't talk about as much in other ways. And through that, from my pastoral level, I had to go bivocational a year ago because of finances in my congregation. And it's a weird situation because it's team ministry. And so they can afford a full-time pastor, but there's two of us. And so it's not quite the same, but we've learned through that process that a big part of the education needed at the congregational level is their own understanding as a layperson in being bivocational. Once they can kind of picture what it means for every single person to be bivocational in the work of discipleship and in whatever work that they're doing, when they begin to understand their work as in part vocation, that they can do the work of ministry and proclaiming the gospel in various ways, they became more open to the idea of their clergy also being bivocational. So it's been taking a shift in our denomination in terms of how we educate, but also then from the congregational level, there's a whole kind of theological reframing and thinking about how the layperson can understand their own vocation that has opened them up to accepting their clergy as bivocational.
Oh, thank you. Kevin.
My name is Kevin McLemore. I'm the Associate Conference Minister for Search and Call, the Pennsylvania Southeast Conference. A couple of quick things. When I was at our General Synod this past summer, I found a book that they were giving away free from Pilgrim Press, published in 1980, and the title of the book was Too Many Clergy, Becoming Clergy Glut, or whatever. It was such an interesting book, and I use it in my Sharing a Pastor workshop all the time to say, hey, this is what was thought, and this is the reality now. I will say that one of the things that desperation does do is get churches to actually consider the idea of sharing a pastor. I think if we had approached our churches 10 years ago, there was a lot more resistance to the idea of sharing a pastor. And now they're willing to talk about it in ways they hadn't. 58% of our churches are now being served by part-time clergy. The third thing that I would say for you, Mitch, and up here in our area, 20 of our churches are actually both ELCA and UCC. And so one of the things we're finding is UCC clergy also serving ELCA and vice versa. And that's been really helpful across denominational lines. The density of the churches here is both a blessing and a curse, which means it's much quicker I can go 15 minutes away and, preach a sermon in another church. It's a great thing. I think the crisis a lot of times is you move further west in the UCC, our churches are farther apart. There's less ability to share pastors. So just a bunch of comments there. I don't know what they mean, but just some interesting insight to me anyway. Thanks.
One thing we discovered about the retired clergy serving churches is that there are so many more retired clergy today than in the past, because of every year the baby boom provides another group in there. But the percentage of the churches across the board is about the same, and there are fewer churches in most traditions today than 20 years ago. So in looking at that, we found an interesting example in a Episcopal diocese in New England, where they were kind of redefining what part-time means. Generally, a lot of times, if you have a retired pastor serving part-time, it means you're paid part-time and you will do limited work, but you'll preach every Sunday for the most part. What they're saying is they're redefining part-time as half-time, meaning every other Sunday for preaching. And there, at least, they have worship leaders who guide the service. I think they even provide them with a sermon they can use if the worship leaders want it. But they found that the worship leaders, they just develop their own sermons and keep going. But from the retired pastor's perspective, the idea of being tied up every weekend is not that appealing for many. But if you can come up with some other arrangement, and so that it may be you need to rethink some of those arrangements that you have. Other comments are sharing from your context.
I'll jump in. I didn't use my electronic hand. So much of what, Tom Harmon, I'm the executive presbyter of Beaver Butler Presbytery, which is in Western Pennsylvania, north of Pittsburgh, 2 counties north of Allegheny County, which houses Pittsburgh, and we're in the Presbyterian Church USA. So much of what's being said here is concurrent with my experience of working with densely populated but smaller and declining membership attendance and all of the different pieces that go into that, even from the role of the communicator of saying, you know, this is where the church is changing and you're not alone in that, but this is across the board, but nonetheless, those changes are here. To retired, the comment I just saw where retired pastors either will preach to their last dying breath or are really ready to say, I'm not going to do anything anymore with the church once I hit my retirement and pension and all that. And not a lot sort of in between, which is interesting. I think one of the questions that I have, as you looked at the either the pastoral models that had shared pastor among 2 congregations or even the bivocational model, whether in some of those questions or just intuition, where might be some encouragement for malleability within congregations? Because as I have those conversations, a lot of what I'm doing is helping a congregation to know that our personnel is very limited. We're in a new time. It's not them, but they still want their real pastor and the identity of that single congregation, as you said, with that single pastor. But it's not just a sense of we need a full-time pastor to be here, but it's sort of an emotional identity of we are a valid community with a full-time pastor. And if we cannot have that full-time pastor, we are not ourselves, so to speak. And, you know, I don't quite know what to do with that other than by just attrition, a number of those churches will end their ministries and new ministries will come up. But bridging that gap is a challenge. Do you have any experience with the churches that may be able to come into that conversation and to say, or, you know, what's helping them to say our new normal is this part-time, and we really feel validated in that, as opposed to we're not who we used to be and we're just really grieving, and the presbytery is not doing its work in getting us our real pastor as a next step.
I'm sure many of you have already found helpful this book, Part-Time is Plenty by Jeffrey McDonald. It may be sharing that with some laity or just having some part of another larger group say, we're trying to help churches think about these issues and what might they be. Excuse me. And but part of the thing is we've got to maybe need to write a new script for ourselves, that we have maybe inadvertently lifted up a model that if a church is a real church, you know, it's got its own pastor and but you're right, that's what we find. Churches feel less than, that somehow they have failed, when they can, not all churches that go to some part-time formula thrive, but and today another factor complicating this is the amount of deferred maintenance so many buildings have today. And so churches then really feel torn, and you so that they could get to a point where almost all of their effort is going toward paying for a pastor, and there's little else energy-wise left for that. And so others have any words that might help Tom on that, or out of your experience, because I'm sure many of you are working with other churches all the time. Jim?
Yeah, when I was in seminary, people who were their second career people in their 30s or 40s were looked really down as being inferior. They weren't taken seriously. And that's sort of what happens with part-time pastors now. They're looked at as being not real pastors. You already mentioned this. We used the book Part-Time is Plenty about a year and a half going to a conference for our region. I work with the American Baptist Churches of New York State. And that book was very helpful in pointing out that going to a part-time pastor is not just a failure on the part of the church. And that's the way they experience that. We have failed, and nobody likes to feel that way. But it also points out some of the real advantages of having a part-time pastor to sort of balance that out. So we found that book to be very helpful. As you said, there's a real emotional barrier to getting a part-time pastor. Well, I never talk about part-time pastors. I talk about multi-income stream pastors. Pastors who need to have multi-income streams. Also, sometimes it looks to me as if two churches sharing a pastor is the obvious solution. But as you said, that's very time intensive. And there's enormous resistance. And usually it takes us 2 years to work with churches to get them to embrace that. But the book, Part-Time is Plenty, I found to be really helpful in terms of saying there are some positive aspects of being part-time.
We have a podcast on the Lewis Center website, which is churchleadership.com, with Jeffrey McDonald, that you might find useful in sharing with some people sometimes on that. Other observations or questions or contributions?
Dr. Weems, I have a question from chat.
Okay.
Churches who were used to the attractional model are having trouble adapting to the increase in the so-called nuns. How are denominations accepting this information and adapting? When adaptation to the new world of decreased interest in organized religion seems to be difficult to accept for many of these denominations, are there tools available to help them adapt?
Well, here's an interesting situation. I think how churches are responding to the pandemic is giving us an example of what maybe some of the problem is. Almost every church will talk about what percentage of their attendance they have compared to pre-pandemic. And that's understandable. But when you think about it, this declining attendance we talked about, for most churches, it started primarily in 2002, and has been going down ever since. The 1990s were fairly strong for worship attendance, even among some mainline denominations that continued to lose membership. PCUSA had a year of gain, Episcopal had a couple of years of gain, United Methodist, ELCA, all had some years of gain in attendance. And then the peak year was 2001, because, not for all, but for some denominations, there was a peak after 9/11 when for 5 Sundays, people attended church more than they had in decades. But then after those 5 Sundays, attendance started going down, and it has never stopped. You can look at 2002, 3, 4, all the way to the latest statistics. They go down each year for most traditions in worship attendance. So think about it. If you're thinking about pre-pandemic, and you see somehow we've got to get back to that normal, well, that normal was killing us. The pre-pandemic normal was we are doing our work in such a way that each year we are reaching fewer people to worship God. And each year we are withdrawing our witness from our community a little bit more. So that's not the direction to go. So, and a lot of times in churches having trouble with transitions is that they're trying to go back to some time in the past that when they look to the future, that's not where they look for hope. It's more to the past. So then it forces you to say, well, who are the people God has given us now? Not just who are the people who haven't come back from the pandemic yet to in-person worship, but who are the people God has given us? And for long-established churches, they're going to have to find a way to fall in love with their communities again. Otherwise, there's going to be no future. And as counterintuitive as it seems, Nancy Ammerman, the sociologist of religion, has pointed out that the longer a church has been in existence, the less connected it tends to be to its community and the less knowledgeable it tends to be. So if you have a community where one church has been there 150 years and one just started services 6 months ago, and you ask people which of these 2 churches will have their finger on the pulse of the community the best, they'll always say the 6 month ago church, which doesn't make sense. If you've been there 150 years, there shouldn't be anything you don't know. But number one, so many of our churches have become unrepresentative of their communities. People who are regular church attenders are older, less diverse, more educated, have more assets, more likely to be married or have been married than the population as a whole. And the other thing we know about regular church attenders now is they tend to spend most of their time with other regular church attenders. So people may have been in a community all their lives, and they say, I know this community like the back of my hand. But what they really know is that part of the community they know. For example, if not had children in 20 years, and yet you can stand in front of the church and see a grade school, how much do they know about that part of the community? So really, when you're talking about who will the churches employ and deploy to accomplish their mission, you really have to help churches go back to the beginning. What is your mission? What has God called you to do? What's going to be different in 5 years in this community because you succeed in this mission? And then what kind of leadership do we need for that? And then we have to recognize, especially in traditions that have normally had a lot of obstacles to being ordained, including educational, we've got to recognize that credentials used to count for far more in terms of credibility in congregations. Today, authenticity is what people are looking for, not so much a credential. And that doesn't mean the credentials aren't important, but it does mean that you just can't rely on that anymore. Is this someone I can trust? Is this someone who has genuine faith? Is this someone who's connected to God in a deep way? So it's interesting to see that we have challenges. Many of them are very similar, but part of our difficulty may be in some models, frankly, models that developed as churches move from the being outsiders to being insiders and becoming far more middle class, and as we sought to professionalize more ministry. So we may have set up some expectations, they just don't fit anymore. Peter Drucker said that when organizations that have been strong start declining, it's not because what they're doing is bad. They're doing good things. It's not what they're doing is wrong. It's their assumptions are wrong. And maybe we need to help people understand what their assumptions are and what can be helpful. What's going to follow from this, and thank you for your valuable time today, you'll receive a PDF that'll have the slides from today, and you will receive a 3-question online survey that will be very important to us in documenting some of the implications that you're seeing out of this. Feel free to stay in touch with us or to follow up with questions. If you don't already get the Lewis Center's free online newsletter every Wednesday called Leading Ideas, please go to churchleadership.com and subscribe, and that way you can keep up with all of the research that we're doing, and as well as articles that can be helpful for you and for other congregations with whom you work. Anything before we end? Thank you very much. Feel free to stay in touch, and goodbye.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.